You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
The Hawker Hurricane, often overshadowed by the sleek and slender Spitfire, it was in many ways Britain's greatest fighter of World War II. While most of the glory went to the Spitfire, the robust and dependable Hurricane did most of the work. Never considered a world beater, it had that remarkable quality of being just good enough, and sometimes better. At the time of Britain's greatest crisis, hurricanes withstood the onslaughts from Germany, Italy and Japan. Like the American B-39, P-40 and F-4F Wildcat, it was one of the early fighters that manned the ramparts and turned the enemy aside. For 3 precarious years, it held the line and bought the Allies valuable time. Without it, Britain would certainly have lost the war. Indeed, the Hurricane flew and fought in more campaigns, on more fronts and in more countries than any other aircraft of World War II. From the first day to the last, the Hurricane was there. This is the story of the remarkable Hawker Hurricane. Germany, 1933. Hitler and his group of thugs take power. Rearmament soon follows. Hitler orders new fighters and bombers for the newly formed Luftwaffe. Tanks, submarines and battleships soon follow. Europe, fearing another war, reacts cautiously. In Britain, calls for a massive rearmament program are shouted down by those seeking appeasement. Just as Hitler begins to consolidate his grip on power, Sidney Cam, Hawker's chief designer, opens discussions with the Air Ministry for a new monoplane fighter, developed from the Fury biplane. Official support proves elusive, but Hawker's board backs their chief designer and approves development of the Fury monoplane as a private venture. Estimated to have a top speed of just 280 miles per hour, the Fury monoplane is soon abandoned. In October 1934, Rolls-Royce announces the development of the PV-12 liquid-cooled engine, the Merlin prototype. Sidney Cam is forced to abandon the Fury and creates a new aircraft capable of handling 1,000 horsepower. The Hawker Interceptor monoplane is born. 1934. The RAF is still largely equipped with fabric-covered biplane fighters and bombers. Steel and aluminium have replaced wood, but the fabric, struts and open cockpits remain. In May 1935, German rearmament accelerates. In response, the British government votes to triple the number of frontline combat aircraft. The move to the modern all-metal monoplane aircraft is, however, slow. February 21st, 1935. The Air Ministry places an order with Hawker for the first Hurricane prototype. For Hawker's designers, the temptation to embrace the new stressed skin construction techniques is tempered by the need to produce the fighter in great numbers. The methods that have served them since World War I would have to be used. As a result, the new Hurricane is constructed using established concepts, modified to suit the new requirement. Mike Potter, founder of Vintage Wings, an organization dedicated to the preservation and restoration of historic aircraft, sees a link between the Hurricane and Hawker's earlier biplanes.
We also have under restoration a Hawker Fury of the early 30s era. And they're not on the same hangar at the present time, but the Fury under restoration, fuselage, and the Hurricane, if we put them side by side, you'd be hard-pressed, except for the 50% difference in size, to see which airplane it belonged to. So the Hurricane fuselage really does hark back to a post-First World War construction technique.
The decision to go with the old-style biplane construction was to hasten mass production, and in that sense it was probably a good choice. They needed to get the contract and they needed to produce fighters. One of the advantages is that the airplane's very inspectable and maintainable. You can almost take the sides off this fuselage with a screwdriver, and getting inside of it is a lot easier than it is with a conventional monocoque airplane that's built like an egg. But it is also labor intensive. The interior steel structure is surrounded by a wooden structure which is surrounded by fabric over most of the airplane, and that takes a lot of different materials and skill sets.
Work on Hawker's monoplane fighter is swift. 9 months later, on November 6th, the first Hurricane takes flight. 3 months later, a top speed of 328 miles per hour is attained, making it the world's first fighter to exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. On June 3rd, 1936, the Air Ministry orders 600 Hurricanes. 1937. The RAF's last biplane fighter enters service 2 years after the first flight of the Hurricane. As a biplane fighter, the Gloucester Gladiator is well equipped, with an enclosed cockpit and 4 .303-inch Browning machine guns. Its overall performance, however, is well below that of the Hurricane. Fortunately for the RAF, there were more Hurricanes in service than Gladiators at the outbreak of the war. RAF Norfolk, 1938. Number 111 Squadron is the first RAF unit to receive the new Hurricane. Here we see them showing off their new mounts for the cameras. Though excited to take them into the air, new pilots still had to be vigilant during their first flights.
The Hurricane's not the easiest airplane to fly. It requires a little bit of technique, and I was surprised at how much work there is. Perhaps easiest to start on the ground, because it almost misleads you. On the ground, the Hurricane is a very well-behaved airplane. The gear is wide, the field of view over the nose is good enough that you can almost see where you're going. You still S-turn, as you always do in a tailwheel airplane, but the sense of the airplane at first is very forgiving and conventional, and I had pretty high expectations. When you first get it into the air, the Hurricane requires a fair amount of attention. The controls are a little bit stiff in terms of friction. It certainly doesn't give you the impression of being a terribly stable airplane. And I was surprised that it's almost impossible to trim the airplane off so that you can release your hands from the controls in a Hurricane. So the result was that it felt a little wobbly.
The first Hurricane Mark I's were equipped with the two-bladed fixed-pitch Watts propeller and fabric-covered wings. This caused some early problems. During high-speed dives, the wing gun panels would partially blow out. Gun heating was also a problem, with guns freezing at heights above 15,000 feet. By 1939, the old Watts propeller was replaced by the de Havilland or Rotol constant speed units. Stressed skin metal wings were also being manufactured. These wings would replace the original fabric models on both the production line and all existing Hurricanes. Hurricane designer Cam and Spitfire designer R.J. Mitchell took vastly different directions when designing the wings of their respective aircraft.
The Spitfire and the Hurricane came from different design precedents, where the parts that were used and the design philosophy in the Hurricane came from the old Hawker biplanes. In fact, the interior wing construction is very similar to the way they were on the Fury and those. The Spitfire, on the other hand, Mitchell came to that design from the Schneider Cup racing seaplanes, and his aerodynamic mantra was about designing a razor-thin wing. In those days, he felt that the fastest airplane would have the thinnest wing, and so everything about the Spitfire was trying to keep the profile drag of the wing and the thickness to a minimum. His design compromise was there was barely enough room for the wheels in the Spitfire's wing. There was no room for fuel, and even mounting guns proved problematic. In the case of the Hurricane, the wing is thick as a conscious design choice to try to reduce weight. If you built a wing and decided that it needed to sustain, say, 8G, the weight of that wing panel would be lighter as the wing got thicker. Imagine a piece of paper as it becomes thinner, it becomes much easier to flex the piece of paper. It loses its bending rigidity. And so one of the primary design considerations in Cam's mind was the empty weight of the airplane. A thick wing was to his advantage in terms of weight, not so much in terms of speed. Design, it's all about compromises.
September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. Britain and France quickly declare war, but do little to assist their Polish ally. As war rages in Poland, RAF Fighter Command readies for battle. 497 Hurricanes in 18 squadrons stand ready, with more on the way. Germany's early victory over Poland is followed by an 8-month period known as the Sitzkrieg, or Phony War. Britain uses this time to prepare for the inevitable onslaught. 4 squadrons of Hurricanes are sent to France to help bolster the British Expeditionary Force. Blitzkrieg, May 10, 1940. German forces invade France, Belgium and Holland. In France, the Luftwaffe targets over 50 airfields with great success. British government reaction is swift. 3 more Hurricane squadrons are sent to France. During the Battle of France, the Hurricanes' first assignment was to target German bombers. Here, they proved very successful. But it also meant tackling the Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-110. The Bf-110 was a long-range strategic Zerstörer, destroyer. Its job? Clear a path through the enemy's defensive fighter screens and keep the bombers safe. As a fighter, the Bf-110 was ill-equipped to dogfight the Hurricane. For a fighter to be successful in aerial combat, speed, acceleration, and maneuverability were key. The Bf-110 possessed the first 2, but was not nearly as nimble and could not accelerate as quickly as the Hurricane. For the Hurricane, the Battle of France was a short and frustrating affair. By the end of May, British troops were evacuating through Dunkirk, and much of northern France was in German hands. By midnight, June 2nd and 3rd, Operation Dynamo was complete. Of the 452 Hurricanes sent to France, just 66 returned to Britain. Not all of these were victims of combat, however. Many were destroyed on the ground, lost in accidents, or simply abandoned during the retreat. Hampered by outdated tactics, squadrons entered battle in rigid sections of 3 aircraft, forcing Hurricane pilots to fight at a distinct disadvantage. Despite all that, Hurricane pilots claimed at least 499 kills. Post-war German records would show 299 aircraft destroyed and 65 seriously damaged by hurricanes. Rest for the Hurricane pilots would be short. Flush with victory over France and the Low Countries, Hitler soon set his sights on Britain. By August 1940, the Luftwaffe moved 934 Bf-109Es to the Channel coast. This would be supplemented by 237 Bf-110s, along with 1,600 bombers. To meet this threat, the RAF had 29 squadrons of Hurricanes and 19 with Spitfires, for a total of 660 serviceable fighters. During the Battle of France, the Hurricane's main opponent had been the Bf-110. In the upcoming Battle of Britain, it would face the more deadly Bf-109E. As a single-seat fighter, the Bf-109 was all business. Swift and heavily armed with 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.92mm machine guns, it outperformed the Hurricane in almost every category.
Bf-109 seems to have been all about performance. It has a very small wing on a very small fuselage, and it is as close to a dart as they could get in the early fighter design. And in terms of speed, they certainly succeeded. It was faster than the Hurricane and even the early model Spitfires by a margin, but it came at the cost of Maneuverability, certainly sustained turn performance was much inferior to either British fighters.
But even with the Bf-109's advantages, the Hurricane managed to hold its own. Day after day, scramble after scramble, Hurricanes rose to meet the Luftwaffe. After 3 months of constant combat, the battle was coming to an end. Unable to destroy the RAF in the air and on the ground, Hitler turned his attention to London. September 15th, 1940. 1,200 Luftwaffe fighters and bombers begin a day-long attack on London. The RAF would be ready with 328 Hurricanes and 177 Spitfires. For the loss of 29 RAF fighters, the British managed to shoot down 57 Luftwaffe aircraft. While the loss ratio was 2-1 in the British favour, it was not the RAF's finest performance. By the end of September, the battle was all but over. Hitler's attempt to destroy the RAF had all but failed, ending any thought of invasion. For the Hurricane and the pilots who flew her, it was a triumph. Without the Hurricane, the Battle of Britain would have been lost. For the Hurricane, the numbers were impressive. Of the 1,185 Luftwaffe aircraft credited to RAF fighters, 656 were accounted for by Hurricanes, of which 222 were Bf-109s. Hurricane pilots would also face another foe. Eager to share in the spoils of victory, Mussolini dispatched 75 bombers and 50 CR-42 and G-50 fighters to take part in the Battle of Britain. 10 BR-20s, escorted by 40 CR-42s, were intercepted by the Hurricanes of No. 46 and 257 squadrons. It was a one-sided battle. 3 BR-20s and 3 CR-42s were shot down. 2 Hurricanes were slightly damaged. During the Battle of Britain, both Hawker factories at Brooklands and Langley were targeted by the Luftwaffe, with minor results. To further protect production facilities, a number of plants were moved underground. As part of the shadow factory scheme, Hurricane production was moved underground at Longbridge. Here, we see a newly completed Hurricane on a motorized ramp, rising to the airfield above ground. How did the Hurricane compare to the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain? As a gun platform, the Hurricane was superior. The 4 Browning machine guns in each wing were grouped tightly together, giving it a better concentration of fire. It was also rugged and able to absorb more battle damage. But even with all that, the Spitfire was the clear superior. Faster, with a higher rate of climb and ceiling, it could outdive the Hurricane with ease.
One of the reasons the Spitfire is so satisfying to fly is that when it does come to putting it in a turn, whether for aerobatic reasons or because you're trying to feel out what its combat maneuvering capability would be, it doesn't take a lot of muscle to put a lot of G on the aircraft.
The Hurricane is the mirror image of that. The flight controls are quite stiff. There's a few pounds of breakout force to move the stick, and so doing anything precisely through friction is always a little bit more work than you'd like. As well, the Spitfire's stability is conventional and positive. For example, if you put the nose down in the Spitfire and accelerate, it will want to return to trim, and you'll feel yourself easing the stick forward as a consequence of its stability. The Hurricane doesn't seem to have that. If you point the nose down, the airplane will accelerate a little bit, but the stick doesn't tend to migrate because the airplane doesn't tend to return to trim. And then the last notable difference between Spitfire and Hurricane when you're maneuvering is attributable to that beautiful elliptical wing on a Spitfire, which was designed to minimize induced drag. The pilot sees that when he pulls G, turns, and maneuvers as a tendency for the airplane to slow down. In the Spitfire's case, it's negligible. You can go into a maneuver at 240 indicated, pull lots of G, make a turn, come back out at your 240 knot entry speed. Didn't cost you a thing. The big fat wing on the Hurricane isn't quite as elegant, and when you maneuver, it costs you speed.
In terms of combat effectiveness, the Spitfire was better. According to John Alcorn's statistical study of the Battle of Britain, which appeared in the July 2000 issue of Aeroplane Monthly, the Spitfire was 1.25 times more effective. The Spitfire also had the advantage of growth and design development. After the Battle of Britain, it was clear the Hurricane could no longer be improved. It would, however, soldier on in other roles. During the German Blitz of 1941, the Hurricane would be pressed into service as a night fighter with marginal results. Without airborne radar, intercepting a German bomber at night was extremely difficult. In the months following the Battle of Britain, the Hurricanes Mark II A and B were introduced. Powered by the Merlin 20 engine, the new Hurricanes were equipped with 12.303-inch Browning machine guns. The Mark IIB was the first to carry bombs and was capable of carrying two 250-pounders. Nicknamed Hurry Bombers, RAF Fighter Command could now take the fight to the Germans. Fighter-bomber sweeps were now the order of the day. Targets included airfields, trains, and coastal shipping. But these low-level missions proved hazardous. Light flak and machine gun fire took a heavy toll. For the Germans, these raids proved more a nuisance than destructive. By the summer of 1942, 24 squadrons were flying Hurricane 2As or 2Bs. The Bf-109F. Introduced in the late fall of 1940, it would prove vastly superior to both the Hurricane and the Spitfire Mark I. The days of the Hurricane as a fighter over Europe were clearly over. But unfortunately for the Germans, the Hurricane still had a few more cards to play. During the Battle of Britain, the Hawker Hurricane proved a tenacious warrior, holding its own against Germany's best fighters. But soon, tenacity would not be enough to guarantee survival. As ever faster German fighters rose up against the RAF, the less agile Hurricane was clearly outmatched. For the Hurricane to remain relevant in the struggle against Hitler, Hawker would have to reinvent their sturdy fighter. Introduced in the spring of 1942, the Hurricane Mark II-C was the most heavily armed single-seat fighter in RAF service. Its four 20mm Hispano cannons packed a considerable punch. Analysis from the Battle of Britain showed the .303-inch machine gun armament to be clearly inadequate. German bombers, like the Junkers Ju-88, were difficult to shoot down. Equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate, they could absorb a vast amount of .303-inch ammunition and remain flying. The new Mark II-C packed a hefty punch. Total rounds carried was 364. Pilots were told to fire short bursts only. Long bursts would slow the aircraft down considerably. One can only speculate as to what the results might have been if the Hurricane had been equipped with 4 cannon during the Battle of Britain. The Mark II-C was also modified to carry a pair of 250 or 500-pound bombs, or a pair of 44-gallon drop tanks. The increased armament offered the Hurricane a new lease of life. By the autumn of 1941, the Hurricane's performance shortcomings excluded it from most daylight operations, but their numbers continued to increase. 57 home-based squadrons were now equipped with Mark II Bs and Cs. June 10th, 1940. Italy declares war on Britain and France. In North Africa and Egypt, the RAF's total fighter force consists of 3 squadrons of Gladiators and just one Orca hurricane. On the strategic island of Malta, 4 hastily assembled ex-Fleet Air Arm Sea Gladiators are all that stand against the Italian Air Force. On June 21st, 8 Hurricanes are ferried to the island via France. Shortly after, France surrenders, cutting this line of supply. To keep their lines of communication open, the British had to find a new way around interfering German or Italian forces. For the British, their advantage lay with their colonial possessions. Takoradi, 1940, the Gold Coast of Africa. Preparations begin on a new airstrip. Takoradi would be the first stepping stone in a long ferry route across Africa to Cairo and Egypt. It was a hazardous journey, 3,000 miles over uninhabited rainforest and desert. The first Hurricanes arrive in September 1940. Shipped straight from the UK, these crated Hurricanes were quickly offloaded, reassembled, and made ready for flight. Due to the long ranges involved, 2 88-gallon ferry tanks were installed. Large white recognition panels were also painted on the tops of the fuselage. The aircraft would then set out in stages, with the first stop being Kano in Nigeria. To guide the Hurricanes, a Blenheim mothership was used to provide navigation and transport supplies. Using HF radio signals to obtain bearings, it would guide the formation from airfield to airfield. Amazingly, there was no radio communication between the Hurricanes and the Blenheim during the flight. In the event of a forced landing, pilots carried with them a water bottle, benzodrine tablets, and a rubber bottle with tablets for converting urine into drinkable water. After reaching Cairo, the ferry pilots would return to Takoradi aboard a BOAC Lockheed Lodestar or RAF Bombay transport. Prior to America's entry into the war, thousands of Americans would volunteer with both the RCAF and the RAF. The result was the first of 3 Hurricane-equipped Eagle squadrons. The initial squadron, number 7-1, formed in September 1940 and saw action in February 1941. 2 other squadrons would follow, and in September 1942, all 3 were officially transferred to the USAAF, becoming the 4th fighter group. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. America and Britain are now at war with Japan. To strengthen the air defenses of Malaya and Singapore, 51 crated Hurricanes are sent by sea, arriving on January 3rd. With its reputation still glowing from the Battle of Britain, it was expected the Hurricane would sweep the Japanese from the sky. That optimism was short-lived. The Hurricanes that arrived on January 3rd were not assembled until the 19th. By that time, Japanese forces were swiftly advancing down the Malayan Peninsula. In the skies above Malaya, Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi A6M-0s quickly overwhelmed the small Hurricane force. By January 28th, of the original 51 Hurricanes, only 20 were left. On February 10th, the last 7 Hurricanes flew to Sumatra. 5 days later, Singapore surrendered to the Japanese. North Africa. Since March 1941, British anti-tank weapons had proven inadequate when dealing with the German Panzer III and IV tanks. The new 57mm anti-tank gun was in short supply. As army commanders pressed for a solution, the RAF offered the new Hurricane Mark II-D, the world's first anti-tank fighter. Armed with 2 40mm Vickers S guns, the new Hurricane was capable of defeating any tank when attacking from the side or the rear. The Vickers S gun rate of fire was 100 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 1,870 feet per second. Each gun was equipped with 15 rounds of ammunition with a mix of high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. By the winter of 1942, the situation in Africa had settled down to an uneasy calm. During this period, No. 6 Squadron took delivery of its first cannon-armed Hurricanes. Urgency was paramount, and pilots immediately began low-level training. Testing revealed that in order to achieve success, it was necessary to approach the target horizontally and at very low level. To help with their aim, tracer ammunition from 2 Browning machine guns was used to judge distance. A captured German tank served as target practice. When these tactics were tried out during Exercise Spartan in March 1943, the results were very poor. This would be in sharp contrast to the outstanding success achieved with the same aircraft in the Western Desert. From June 1942 until May 1943, No. 6 Squadron flew a total of 319 anti-tank sorties. According to official records, 47 tanks, 5 armoured cars and 3 half-tracks were destroyed. Often, hits from the 40mm cannons only disabled an armoured vehicle. 126 other vehicles, including 103 trucks, were also hit or destroyed. But it came at a price. 47 Hurricanes would be lost, with 40 being shot down in action and 5 pilots killed in combat. Only 1 was shot down by a fighter. It was clear. Low-level ground attack was dangerous and costly. Unfortunately, the urgent need for new tank busters in North Africa left little time for the application of additional armor protection. The Hurricane's liquid-cooled Merlin proved extremely vulnerable to ground fire. A single rifle-caliber bullet in the oil, glycol tank or radiator was often lethal, especially at low level. The tank-busting Hurricane had other limitations. As a specialized weapon, targets were limited. The combat situation had to suit tactics as well. If tanks and vehicles were not caught out in the open, the tank-busting Hurricane would sit idle. By the end of 1943, 800 Mark IIDs were delivered. While No. 6 Squadron's exploits were well known, 3 other squadrons, all based in England, used the tank-busting Hurricane with varying degrees of success. As a pure fighter, the Hurricane's performance no longer matched the newer BF-109G or FW-190. Their lack of speed was not Hawker's only problem. It no longer made economic sense to build and construct Hurricanes as frontline fighters.
Development of the Hurricane during the war was limited in part by the aerodynamic limitations of a thick wing, and in part by how labor-intensive it is to build a steel frame wrapped in a wooden structure, wrapped in fabric, and it took a lot of materials. There were people looking for Merlins, for Mosquitoes and Lancasters and Spitfires and Mustangs, and so because of all the resources it took to build the rest of the airplane and its aerodynamic limitations, the Hurricane quickly slipped to the end of the list for priorities.
Even with these drawbacks, the Hurricane continued to fight in some new and unusual roles. One of the most outlandish was the Cat Fighter, or Hurricat, a seaborne fighter rocket catapulted from a ship to provide convoy protection. German long-range FW-200 Condors, in combination with U-boats, were taking a heavy toll of British shipping. To counter the threat, 35 merchant ships were converted with a single Hurricane and catapult system. These ships were designated CAM ships, Catapult Assisted Merchantmen. CAM ships and their Hurricanes would shoot down at least 9 FW-200s for the loss of just one Hurricane pilot. Unfortunately for the pilot, once the mission had been completed, he had to either ditch the aircraft or bail out close to a friendly ship. When the Royal Navy entered the war, its aircraft carriers were equipped with a mix of multi-role bomber and torpedo aircraft. There were no single-seat fighters. Desperate for a shipboard fighter, the Admiralty turned to the trusted Hurricane. The first Sea Hurricanes, equipped with an arrestor hook, were designated Mark 1Bs. Sea Hurricanes saw action in the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Russia. It was, however, not the ideal fighter for the job. Without folding wings, it took up a lot of deck space, and its overall performance was lacking. By 1943, the Sea Hurricane was replaced by the more capable Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a true naval fighter. In the end, 1,200 Hurricanes were converted for maritime use. By the summer of 1943, the Hurricane was withdrawn from service in England. Hurricane units began to receive a new Hawker fighter, the Typhoon. Powered by the 2,000 horsepower Napier Sabre engine, the Typhoon was fast and heavily armed. Like its predecessor, Hawker had designed the Typhoon with a thick wing. The Typhoon's performance at altitude was disappointing, and like the Hurricane, it soon found a role as a deadly ground attack fighter. Armed with 8 air-to-ground rocket projectiles and 4 20mm cannon, the Typhoon proved to be one of the most devastating ground attack aircraft of the war. The Typhoon would be followed by the even more impressive Hawker Tempest. Equipped with a thin laminar flow wing, the new Tempest was a great improvement over the Typhoon and was considered one of the best low to medium altitude fighters of the war. September 7th, 1942. The government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Henry Tizard, states, "The Hurricane has certainly outlived what everybody thought would be its useful life because of its value for aggressive action against land targets." The key to the Hurricane's survival was its thick wing and the development of new weaponry. Bombs, rocket projectiles, and large caliber cannon were the ingredients for this renaissance. The Hurricane's thick wing, which even Sidney Cam regarded as a cause for regret, was now one of its best assets.
I don't think the design of the Hurricane's wing ever anticipated the additional stores, bomb racks, rocket projectiles, or even external fuel tanks that grew into the airplane over time. It's because it was a thick wing that it had a lot of structural margins, and it was relatively easy to retrofit these things. As well, the thick wing had the advantage of making the Hurricane obsolescent in terms of fighter performance, in terms of speed, early in its career, and so having tooled up to produce lots of Hurricanes, it became an easy design choice to press them into service as a ground attack airplane, for which it performed admirably when it was no longer really an air superiority fighter.
One of the problems with the Spitfire was the wing wasn't thick enough to find a good solution for both putting retractable gear into the wing and also putting the armament you needed. It was much easier on airplanes with a thicker wing to put the fuel tanks and the armament and the gear retraction.
The Hurricane, armed to the teeth with weapons, fought bravely on. Number 6 Squadron, newly transferred to the Balkan Air Force, would prove to be the longest-serving Hurricane squadron in the RAF. With just a week before Germany's surrender, the Hurricanes of Number 6 Squadron attacked 16 German troop ships in the Gulf of Trieste. War for the Hurricane in Europe was finally over. As the role of the Hurricane faded in Europe, on the other side of the world, the Hurricane would battle on to the bitter end. After the fall of Singapore, British and Indian forces would continue to fight Japanese forces in Burma. The Burma campaign was one of the longest of the war. During the summer of 1942, hurricanes began to arrive at a rate of 50 a week. By September 1943, the RAF had over 1,000 hurricanes in theatre. But victory would not come easily. Spring 1944. The Japanese prepared to invade India. By March, the Imphal Plain and the garrison town of Kohima were surrounded. Here, RAF air superiority won the day. While Spitfire Mark 8s cleared the skies of Japanese fighters, 10 squadrons of Hurricanes pounded the Japanese forces below. By July, the siege was over. Over that period, Hurricanes flew 6,000 sorties a month. In the final months of the war, the Hurricane was replaced by Spitfires and the massive P-47 Thunderbolt. When Japan finally surrendered, 3 squadrons of Hurricanes were still in frontline service. Armed with cannon, rockets, bombs, and the newly developed napalm, the Hurricane remained a formidable weapon during the last 4 years of the war. Its versatility points to a fascinating paradox in the Hurricane story. For an aircraft of such a transitional design, the Hurricane was both modern and dated, revolutionary and conventional. At its core, the Hurricane was quintessentially British. A bulldog of a plane, it reflected the nation's wartime character: reliable, tough, determined. After the war, Hurricanes continued to serve. Amazingly, No. 6 Squadron continued to fly the Hurricane as an Army cooperation unit in Palestine. The Indian Air Force operated 2 squadrons until 1947. The Irish Free States Air Force kept their 13 Hurricanes flying until that same year, and Portugal used them until 1951. The last Hurricane to be built by Hawker, PZ-865, now flies with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. It also appeared in the 1969 Battle of Britain epic as Sir Keith Park's personal aircraft. The arrival of the new jet fighters, beginning with the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire, did not spell the end for Sidney Cam and Hawkers. Turning his attention to the new frontier of jet fighter production and design, Sidney wasted no time in producing the Hawker Seahawk. On September 3, 1948, the first prototype took to the air. In 1949, Hawker would receive an order for 151 Seahawks. The Hawker Hunter, the last in a long line of outstanding fighters designed by Sidney Cam. The genius of his design began with the Hawker Fury, the most successful biplane fighter of the 1930s. World War II would see the contributions made by the incomparable Hurricane, Typhoon, and Tempest. The Hunter was a Cold War classic. Considered by many as the best-looking and best-handling combat fighter of the 1950s, the Hunter would serve the RAF well into the 1960s. The crown in Sidney Cam's career would have to be the Hawker Siddeley Harrier. Far from the fabric and wood of the Hurricane, the Harrier was truly revolutionary. Powered by a Pegasus vectored thrust turbofan engine, the Harrier was the world's first vertical takeoff and landing fighter. Among all of Cam's rich achievements, the Hurricane has to be the most significant. Without his persistence, the future history of Britain, even mankind, might have been very different. As a tribute, Flight magazine said it best. Without detracting in any way from the magnificent courage, skill, and endurance of the fighter pilots, the British victory was in some measure due to Hawkers, who produced the aircraft in time and sufficient numbers to enable the pilots to turn the day.
A lot has been said about the Hurricane, the Spitfire, and the Bf-109 in terms of which is the best fighter. And I think the most honest answer is that a good pilot will fly his airplane to its peculiar strengths and avoid being worked into a corner where he suffers from its weaknesses. And there were exceptionally capable pilots in Hurricanes, Spitfires, and 109s.
The summer of 1940 was a moment in which the world was convinced Hitler's Germany would prevail. It was the Hurricane that helped turn the tide. For the first time, Nazi invincibility had been defeated. The once distant hope for victory was now a clear and unstoppable reality.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.